So how many of you, when you were children, actually had illusions or dreams of being a superhero? I mean, think about it. Isn't there something intriguing about the story and the adventure of those who were all-powerful that could somehow rescue the person who was being threatened, or just the belief that good could overcome evil and that somehow we could be a part of the story? The truth is, life sometimes does require us to step out of our comfort zone and to do something that's right. And even though we will never probably excel to the height of being a superhero, there's a sense in which we're all called every day to do heroic things. But here's the question we all have to wrestle with. Where does the power, where does the strength come to do the kind of heroic things that we may be called to do in life? I mean, we're not like superheroes. We don't have this supernatural power that comes from some alien planet. But the question is, how do we find the resolve and the strength to do the things that we're supposed to do, the courage that we need to face a world that sometimes needs us to stand up, to speak out? The truth is, fear can be a crippling thing. And most of us as leaders and parents don't want our children to grow up and be paralyzed by fear that will keep them from achieving certain things in life, accomplishing what God has called them to do, especially as it relates to the world around them and how they interact with people and the responsibility of being a part of this mission that God's given them. That we somehow give them the courage to understand what it means, even though they're afraid, to do the right thing. That's why we define courage as being brave enough to do what you should do, even when you're afraid. We think fear is a normal response that most of us deal with every day to some degree, but the issue is, where does the strength come to allow us to overcome our fear? When does the need become so important that it overshadows the thing that paralyzes us? Ultimately, we want to raise a generation, don't we, of teenagers and kids who understand a principle, a truth, that will allow them to face a world with a different kind of courage. You see, the goal is for us to raise everyday heroes, not superheroes, but kids and teenagers and a generation who understands that there will be times they'll have to stand up against the bully, the person who's doing something cruel to somebody else, or they have to speak out for the sake of others who may not have a voice, or in a lot of cases where they simply refuse to do the wrong thing even though the crowd seems to be going that direction. And in doing that, what we are ultimately helping them understand is that they have a source of power, a source of strength as believers that sets them apart. In other words, there's a simple truth and a simple promise that's made to them that they can carry with them for the rest of their life. And as a leader and as a parent, we hope you'll make that crystal clear. There's a memory verse that gives you a hint to what that strength is, because here's what it says. Psalm 56:3 says this, "When I'm afraid, I will trust in you." In other words, there are going to be times I'm afraid. There are going to be times when I'm timid about doing what is right or taking the stand or speaking out. But because I trust in a power that's greater than me, I'll have the strength, the resolve that I need to be courageous. One of the reasons that I like Batman is because Batman was really an ordinary guy. He was different than the rest of the superheroes in the sense that he had no incredible superpowers. He was just an ordinary person who decided he was going to fight injustice. And he began to, with his creativity, his innovation, come up with some ways that he could be who he needed to be and show courage to a generation. That's why I like so many of the stories in the Bible that we're going to talk about this month. Because again, they're ordinary people, men and women who had no superpowers except for the fact that they knew God had a mission for them and that they understood His promise that He would always be there with them. One of the most powerful stories that illustrates courage is the story of David and Goliath. I think we forget that David was a teenager who faced a giant when the army was running and afraid. And in the story of David, if you look and you unpack it, the powerful part of this for a leader or for a parent is to listen to what David said when he explained why he needed to face Goliath and where he got his strength from. Remember when Saul questioned him? He said, no. He said, I killed a lion, I killed a bear, and the Lord delivered me from them. The Lord will also deliver me from this giant. David knew, even though he had every reason in the world to be afraid of this giant, that God was with him. He decided he would do the right thing because he trusted in the presence of God. Then there's the story of the teenagers Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego when they were actually refusing to do the wrong thing and standing up for what was right. And the powerful part of the story that we just want kids to somehow visualize is when they're thrown into that fiery furnace, how there was a fourth person that appeared, and he seemed as if he were the Son of God. So don't we want our kids to grow up and know whenever they have to face adversity or difficult situations or make a choice to do what is right, that God is there. In the story of David and Goliath, God was there. In the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, God was there. And in the story of Esther, when Esther has to find the courage to walk in front of the king, to plead a case for her people, for an entire nation, even though it could cost her her life, she spoke out and she had a voice for those who didn't have a voice. Again, why? Because it was part of her mission. It was the fact that God had given her a calling to do that, and that because it was the right thing to do, God was there. Then we're going to end this month with a story about a man named Daniel. It just so happens that there was a conspiracy to get him killed, and the only way they could do him in was to pass a law that they knew he would disobey. And so here's Daniel. The law's been passed that he cannot worship his God, but he does it anyway. Why? Because even though I'm sure there was some fear there somewhere, he was more respectful to his God. He had a greater fear for God in a sense than he did for the people around him, in the sense that he knew God's ability, he knew God's command, he knew who God was. And so he traded those two, and he decided that he would do the right thing. And he worshiped God in the face of everyone who was threatening to kill him. And he ended up being thrown in a lion's den, and God was there. And God rescued him. It was a miracle in Scripture. It's a very powerful illustration again of how God promises to be there when we do the right thing. We all really do have the potential to be everyday heroes because we're a part of something that's bigger than any one of us individually. It's something that God has determined He wants to do in our generation, and to invite kids and teenagers into that story is a very, very powerful thing. The interesting thing when you read Scripture that we kind of want to remind kids of is that whenever there was an adversary, or whenever there was a difficult situation, whenever there was a giant or someone who was trying to threaten, to kill, God always, always, always showed up. And the important thing to remember is that it's God's presence that gives us the power to push through and to do what is right. It doesn't mean that the giant will always fall down. It doesn't mean that there will not be some fire that we don't feel and pain that we experience, because that's true too. It just means that God will keep His promise to be there with us. And courage is deciding, even when I'm afraid, that I can know God is there and I can do the right thing anyway.